I'd like to introduce Dr. Michael Kiparsky, who's the Associate Director at the Wheeler Institute for Water Law and Policy at the Berkeley Law School, and also holds a research appointment with the National Science Foundation-funded Collaborative Engineering Research Center. He has published on governance for complex water systems, the impact of climate change on water resources, and risk analysis. He will bring both his technical and policy-based perspectives into his closing remarks. Dr. Kiparsky.
So I'd like to start by giving some well-deserved props to the organizers of the event, in particular to Andrew Collier, who's you've seen with the mic. I think we'll all agree that this is not just a great student-run event, but it's a great event, period. And so maybe we can all give a hand to Andrew for all his efforts. Also want to acknowledge a few of the event sponsors, Martin Smith and Carolyn Wright at the Berkeley Institute for the Environment, Joe Mackness at the Center for Responsible Business at Haas, Carolyn Remick and David Sedlak at the Berkeley Water Center, Scott Bryan at Imagine H2O, and Rebecca Peters at the Berkeley Water Group. So, not to diminish the efforts of the excellent panelists who have spoken thus far, but I think it's clear that I have the most difficult job of the afternoon. The only reason for that, of course, is that I'm the only thing standing between you and cocktails. So, but as I was walking up here, I realized that I've been asked to talk on closing remarks, but Andrew, I forgot to get from you the actual topic that you wanted me to talk about. Do you actually have that? So I'm sorry for my disorganization here. Thanks. Let's see. Are you sure? Okay. It says here, Steve Jobs versus Ben Horenstein. Can that be right? Really? All right. Let's roll with it and see what happens. So, what I think Andrew is imagining here is a virtual battle of champions of technological innovation in our time. Steve Jobs put iPods, iPhones, and iPads in our pockets. Nemo and the Incredibles on our kids' movie screens, and even computers that don't try to shut down your PowerPoint deck in our backpacks. So Ben Horenstein, as some of you know, is a manager at East Bay Mud, which has managed to reduce the energy intensity of its wastewater treatment. So I'm going to continue with these caricatures, and I trust that you've figured out that these are deliberately provocative and not to be taken literally. Let's think about Steve Jobs and the first iPod. Arguably, the first iPod was not something new. MP3 players already existed. Most or all of the technological inner workings of that iPod were bought and purposed for this new gadget rather than being developed de novo by the Apple company itself. So Steve Jobs was undeniably a brilliant product designer and marketer, but comparing from an technology innovation perspective with the cutting edge science and the technical advances that we've seen discussed today and that we know are going on up the hill here and at Stanford through, for example, the Renew It effort that David is here representing, one has to ask, does the iPod hold a candle to the kind of water innovation technologies that we see waiting in the wings? From an innovation perspective, I would say yes, it blows it out of the water. The reason starts with the difference between invention and innovation. Invention can refer to the process of devising something useful that wasn't previously known or existing. So I would think about invention as determining a new process in the laboratory or publishing a scientific paper on a deeper understanding of chemistry of wastewater treatment. Innovations, on the other hand, provide creative drivers of change in markets and society, Schumpeter's definition. And innovation includes the products of invention plus their commercialization and introduction into markets and practice. So Steve Jobs was able to cross that boundary between invention and innovation. So Ben Horenstein is the director of environmental services, I believe, at East Bay Mud. And over a multiple year effort, Ben is sort of my proxy for a lot of people, though he had a big leadership role in this, and who's been responsible for turning East Bay Mud's wastewater treatment plant down the road here in Oakland into the first electricity positive wastewater treatment facility in the country, as Ralph mentioned earlier. So note that this was conceptually really the same as making an iPod. They adapted existing technology to a new need for the most part. Anaerobic digesters, and in fact, those same digesters have been in use for decades. But I think that the genius of what Ben and the rest of his team have done here is to take the ingredients that they already had and add to it by actually using active acquisition of a new stream of biomaterials to make use of the excess capacity to generate more biogas and more energy in a variety of different ways. It involved trucking in fats, oils, and grease, as well as additional waste streams later from winery waste to chicken blood. And ultimately, you have a significant increase in the energy production and the capturing of that energy. And so what you have is refinement of an existing technique for a new purpose. Now, I want to be quite clear here. For the sake of maybe some light entertainment, sort of glossing some of these distinctions, but in no way would I want to diminish the significance of this achievement. Quite to the contrary, I would submit to you that if people like those who you've heard speak today are striving to provide what we might call thought leadership, equally important in my eyes is Ben's role as what I might term an action leader. Now, naturally, these are overlapping functions, and many people, including some of those in this room, will play both roles simultaneously. But humor me and let me make this distinction. Part of action leadership is doing things in fundamentally new ways for a water utility. East Bay Mud entered and possibly created new markets. They worked to change entrenched cultures within the district itself. They took on and managed new financial and political risk. These are significant changes, particularly for a conservative industry. I'll further suggest to you that action leaders and the nature of how they lead is particularly critical to the future of this industry. I'll circle back to that point in a couple minutes here. Now, in fact, if I were really to try and weigh the achievements of Steve Jobs and Ben Horenstein as innovators, I would say it would be no contest. All Steve Jobs had to do was put together a new product and outcompete the rest of the world. That's it. That is a much easier task, I would argue, than Ben's was, and that many of those in this room face every day. The reason I'd argue this is the following. Innovation in water is different, in part, because institutions matter so much. So, if I can break that down just a little bit. The first part of that argument is probably non-controversial. Technological innovation is really only part of the story. That is, having a better technology doesn't in and of itself lead automatically to better outcomes. However, I would even put it in a little stronger terms than that. Institutions are critical to unlocking the potential for actualization of the kinds of audacious ideas that we've heard today from Peter and from Ralph, and from David and Paula, and others on the panels. I would argue that a central challenge for urban water is the institutional barriers that must be overcome to enable innovation to happen. So, what is an institution anyway? Some people equate the word institution with an organization. So East Bay Mud is an institution, and that's true. But I prefer a more inclusive definition. For example, institutions as the rules, norms, and conventions that govern human behavior and decision making. And this is consistent with the work of Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, for example. Note that this definition includes organizations, but it's not limited to them, in part because organizations can't really, when you get down to it, be separated from the laws, the regulations, the culture, as we have heard Richard Harris allude to, the economics, human behavior, as Richard and Peter discussed, and so forth. Each of these can become a barrier, and I would argue needs to be looked at quite carefully. So, again, because you're waiting for me to get out of the way so you can have a drink, I'm only going to talk about one. And that example we've also heard a bit about today from Richard and others in the room, and it's a really important one, and it's implicit in some of the things that come up all the time. It's a cultural institution, namely conservative decision-making and risk aversion. Risk aversion is the tendency to avoid or minimize risk and uncertainty in someone's decision-making. As I talk about this, I want to start by quoting Martha Davis, who said a few weeks ago at Stanford that water is a me too industry, not a me first industry. Now think about that. This is really important for the shape that action leadership ends up taking. And here's why. Let's accept, for the sake of argument, that action leadership based on grand vision and futuristic thinking of the type that Ben has been doing is relatively rare. And, well, I guess by definition, it is. But if, in contrast, other water managers than the action leaders prefer to make decisions based on things like best management practices, proven concepts, safe choices, in other words. That is the me too, not the me first water decisions. And if, as David pointed out earlier in his panel, long infrastructure life cycles constrain the pace of change in urban water, then what we have is, in essence, a strong path dependency that's implied by these conditions. So, big words. David said it better. He said you have infrastructure locking. And what that means is that whatever choices the next round of action leaders make will be followed. Ralph is flying his client out to look at what East Bay Mud has done because they're the cutting edge. So, in essence, we have others in the industry following the cutting edge now, which we might think of as amplifying the effect of the current set of decision makings. So what this brings into sharp focus for me anyway is the idea that we, as a water community, need to figure out how to get our action leaders to make what Ralph so nicely calls these industry-defining choices, to push the envelope as far as possible in the near term. And Other motivators for this are, and we don't have time to get into it, but it's been alluded to a number of times, the urgency of climate change. Peter mentioned both mitigation and adaptation, which sometimes seem like faraway things, but we're realizing are actually urgent on a very short time frame for if we want to actually avoid very serious impacts to water and other areas of our lives. So part of the upshot here lies in the importance of drawing really tight connections between the thought leadership, as exemplified by the panelists who you heard talk earlier, and the action leadership, as exemplified by my symbolic Ben Horenstein. So, why is there such risk aversion in water resources? I want to be very clear on one element of risk aversion. Risk aversion is not meant as a personal comparison. That is, I'm not saying that Steve Jobs, the person, is in any way comparable to Ben Horenstein, the person, and one is more the independent cowboy who should be lionized in this kind of broader culture of commerce that we have, or any type of value decision here. What we're not looking at here is saying anything about the people who make these kind of decisions, because I really don't have the information to do that. What I think is more important is to think about the incentives and reward structures that are faced by the decision makers in each sector, and to compare them. So a cartoon example. Steve Jobs took a $1 a year salary when returning to Apple, but he became a gazillionaire because he had some stock. For the water managers in the room, a question for you. Raise your hand if, when you come up with an idea that improves the bottom line at your organization, you get a piece of the action. Right? No hands. Okay. So now that is half of risk aversion. That's the upside reward piece. It exists in the private sector, and water managers, by and large, don't have it. Or certainly not as directly. There are ways that one gets payoff for risk. Ben Horenstein gets to be the subject of my talk, for example. However, Steve Jobs, we have to remember, failed at a number of points in his career. He was fired from Apple at some point, from his own company. The Newton was a bomb. You could come up with a few others, I'm sure. No sweat, it worked out fine for him, right? But water, if not delivered in sufficient quantity to meet demands in urban settings, all hell breaks loose. And more seriously, failing to meet treatment standards for drinking water or wastewater has serious and very immediate consequences. So both of these things illustrate the difference in the downside risk that's faced by water managers. And what I'm hypothesizing here is that water managers face quite a bit of the perception of downside risk and real downside risk without the corresponding upside. So just to kind of sum up this line of thought, risk aversion is just one example, but it exemplifies a broader point. Institutions have a strong influence on the pace and the nature of technological change in urban water systems. And it's critically important, given the urgency of the stressors faced on these systems, that we try to understand the nature of these institutions and how they influence things, and figure out ways to address those. Now, for all these thought experiments and wild suppositions that I've made over the last few minutes, we, and by we, I mean here the community of researchers who's interested in understanding and trying to help water systems work better. We really don't know that much about water systems on these terms. So our research program is trying to address this. We, and now, I mean we as members of this broader Renew It effort, which David leads, and Stanford and Berkeley work together on a lot of these types of questions. We have an explicit emphasis in this Renew It program on joining forces between technologists, social scientists, legal scholars, economists. Harrison Fraker is here representing planners to try and understand the barriers that exist in urban water systems. I'm just going to give a few ongoing ways that we, and I'm changing the definition of we once again to mean we at the Wheeler Institute for Water Law and Policy at Berkeley Law, in collaboration with our friends around Berkeley and Stanford and abroad, are trying to answer some of the questions that I've implicitly posed in this little sketch. So first, we are working to learn from other fields. And from what's written about innovation in other areas, and the little that's been written about innovation in water in particular. Most recently, we did this in the form of an article. David was one of the co-authors, along with myself and others, that synthesizes some of the viewpoints about innovation as they apply to urban water from a variety of perspectives. I'm delighted to share that with anybody who is interested. Second thread is starting to take a broader look at this landscape. In collaboration with Buzz Thompson at Stanford, we're conducting a survey to take a course first look at innovative behavior among California utilities. In particular, we're interested in some potentially seemingly very basic questions about innovation and its relationship to institution. Basic like, how much consideration or even openness is there to innovative technology and management choices among water managers? Related to that, what features of a water utilities structure might influence its innovativeness? Governance structure, budget, size. I imagine that we all have some hypotheses, but when we can say these things with a little bit of confidence, I think these conclusions might lead to some actionable implications, such as how to foster learning within the industry. For those of you who are decision makers at California Utilities, please look for these surveys coming soon to an email inbox near you. Number three is drilling down a little bit deeper into examples where innovation has and hasn't been successful in the water sector through case studies. We have a series of case studies that we're working on to try and unpack at a finer grained level the barriers to innovation and how they were or were not overcome in these situations, to try and tell these types of stories and ultimately distill lessons learned that can be more general and hopefully help others in the industry. So learn from action leaders who have sort of forged new paths. So through all this, our overarching goal is to help essentially shorten the time frame of the innovation life cycle in the urban water cycle as a whole in California. Just to finish up, I'll leave you with a few messages, and a lot of this is targeted at the students here. The first is a message of urgency. If we wait for diffusion to take place at the pace that's dictated by the water industry, with decadal scale infrastructure turnover and generation times, the world will end before we've succeeded at a national or global scale in being able to adapt or mitigate in the faces of the stressors that we've heard mentioned here today. What we need, and for the business students in the room, I hope that you're listening, is to affect change from the outside, and that's a push model of innovation. But in addition to that, I think we need institutional change to enable an increasing amount of the pull model, but first we need to figure out what exactly those institutional changes should be. So, the very final sentence. If you want to make some money in water, I think that the people who figure out how to crack this institutional nut will be able to drink deeply at the trough. Thank you very much, and the bar is now open.